What's up, people? Welcome back to the Costs of Christianity. In this episode, we'll be exploring the realities of Christian morality. As usual, we'll be moving along chronologically, looking at evolved morals, the controversy between Paul and the apostles, moving on to some of the moral difficulties experienced by the clergy and monks, and finishing with the immense transformation that culminated in modern Christian morality. This one is a little bit more personal for me. I've watched countless debates between Christians and atheists, and every time the topic of morality comes up, I've never been satisfied by the offerings made by either side of the debate. The Christian side inevitably claims exclusive access to a morality based in objectivity, and the atheists inevitably point to the horrors committed in the name of Christianity. To begin with, morals are a matter of evolution. We see basic concepts of morality in some of the closer primates, and to differing extents in animals such as elephants, birds, and dolphins. If humans hadn't evolved relatively complex morals, we never would have survived as a species. As the capacity for extreme sociability is one of the defining features of humanity, and morality is mostly a function of social interaction, objective morality revolves around anything that enhances sociability and facilitates cooperation. In contrast, for Christianity, objective morality comes from God. But the question is, which God? Is it the God of the Jews that killed off tens of thousands of his chosen people for complaining as they wandered the desert? That doesn't seem very likely. There probably wouldn't be any humans left. Was it the God of Jesus, who was less overtly violent but still preferred the Jews and expected the rules he'd given them to be followed within reason? Or was it the God of Paul, the God who, oh so conveniently, only cared if you believed in him? And considering that the morals of Paul's God are so much more simplistic, it's worthwhile to stop and take a look at why that might be. While Jesus and Paul were both Jews, some of the Jewish people accepted the teachings of Jesus, but they entirely rejected Paul's teachings. Frustrated by his failures, Paul then took his message to the Gentiles who were more accepting, and given Paul's background, that turn of events may not be so surprising. Said to have hailed from Tarsus, a city supposedly founded by Perseus, dominated by pagans until the 4th century CE, and strongly associated with demigods like Hercules, seen here, Paul would have been immersed in Greco-Roman mythology from a young age. Considering that the Greek and Roman gods were primarily concerned with belief and praise, as demonstrated in texts like Homer's Odyssey, it may not be coincidental that Paul's God desired the same, and that the Gentiles were accordingly more likely to take up his message. Paul went on to make claims of visions from Jesus, who gave him special instructions and commanded that he be the sole emissary to the Gentiles, a message conspicuously absent from the Gospels. Paul claims Jesus, but Jesus never claims Paul. It's literally unbelievable that over all his time with the disciples, Jesus didn't make the slightest effort to prepare them for Paul's divisive, contradictory message. And in fact, several of Jesus' statements preclude the existence of such a figure. Like when Jesus tells his disciples that they won't finish spreading his message to the nearby Jewish cities before he would return and end the world. But, like just about everything else Jesus said, he probably didn't mean that either. And considering the glaring difference between the messages of Paul and Jesus, it isn't any wonder why Jesus' disciples rejected Paul. Where the book of Acts hints at the discord between them and goes on to smooth it over, Paul himself never attempts to reconcile the rift. Considering the many points where the book of Acts directly contradicts information found in Paul's letters, which were composed decades before Acts, it seems safer to trust Paul's version of events. When Paul repeatedly attacks the beliefs of other Christians, it's very likely he's referring to the Jewish converts won over by Jesus' own disciples. After all, Jesus had only died some 2 decades before Paul began writing, and Christianity had yet to develop the extremely diverse belief systems that would spawn the thousands of Christian denominations, so it's difficult to estimate exactly who else he would possibly be referring to. Moving on, by the 4th century, major church figures like John Chrysostom were already writing about the rampant corruption seen among many church leaders. While that had, of course, taken place to a lesser extent prior, with the marriage of church and state, the access to excess was a temptation that many church leaders found irresistible. Influential Christians condemned that from time to time, but once corruption found a home in the church, it was there to stay. In later centuries, reacting to the extensive, blatant immorality they saw marring the legitimacy of their faith, devout Christians would found monasteries and convents, but all of those eventually found themselves subject to the exact same vices. Over time, devout orders like the Franciscans and Cistercians gathered immense power, and those drawn to such power took advantage of it. The cycle of corruption was unbreakable. But what does corruption matter when all you have to do to be saved is believe? Given that the whole world had to be converted before Jesus would return, it's remarkable that God wouldn't have chosen more ethical people to bear his name and spread his message. That corruption never left the church and is still apparent in the endless flow of scandals coming out of the megachurches and Catholicism. So, considering Christianity's history, is it really so surprising that we're left with the moral monstrosity that it's become? The gods of Jesus, Paul, and the Old Testament are all drastically different, and most people inevitably devise their own hybrid of the three, their God conveniently having the same morals as they do. That leads Christians to take vastly differing stances on homosexuality, the transgendered, to what extent women should be dehumanized, slavery, violence, wealth, drug use, dietary restrictions, tattoos, gambling, dancing, music, and on and on and on. But, oddly enough, no one seems concerned with offending God by wearing conflicting fabrics. Weird. And this is a huge component of why every Christian invents their own brand of Christianity. Every believer chooses which rules they want to follow and to what extent. A perfect example of that fact in action can be seen in how few Christians read the Bible. It always surprises me when I meet a Christian with knowledge of the Bible, as knowledge of the Bible is the exception and not the rule. And why would they need to read it? They already know everything it says. It says what they want it to say. Alright, sorry for the intrusion, but I recorded this a little later after coming across something interesting. So I googled the exact verses about wearing conflicting fabrics, and the first non-Wikipedia article that comes up provides the perfect example. So in the article, the author explains the precise meaning and potential background of the Old Testament fabric law. The author then claims that it isn't a moral law, but goes on to admit not knowing the exact reason that the law was given. If the author doesn't know the reason, how could they possibly know whether it concerned morals? And given that God personally killed his own chosen people over issues so seemingly minor as incense ceremonies, is it really so outlandish that conflicting fabrics would be a moral issue as well? Further, aren't all of God's laws moral? God even starts off the verse with, "Keep my decrees." Committing the crime would be disobeying God, and how is that not a matter of morals? The author finishes the article by pointing out that the Old Testament laws don't apply to Christianity, but the Christian perspective on that all comes down to whether you believe Jesus or Paul. Also, one more thing that I forgot to mention earlier. The points that I make obviously don't apply to all Christians. The central theme here is that we see far more harm from Christianity than benefit, and that's been the case for nearly 2,000 years now. If that's what divine inspiration looks like, I don't want any part of it. We can do better, and if we're ever going to thrive as a species, we have to. And that is how Christianity birthed the destructive individualism that defines U.S. culture. Some 70% of U.S. citizens call themselves Christian, and far from the Christian claims of a monopoly on morality, every Christian designs their own religion and accordingly their own God. As their God has the same morals that they do, they have a unique relationship with their God, and that divine favoritism elevates them, while to varying extents, diminishing others. And the American fixation on destructive individualism is closely tied with our approach to capitalism and our focus on freedom. Living in any community means giving up certain freedoms. Fortunately, most of us give up the freedom to public nudity, many of us give up the freedom to disobey traffic rules, and some of us even give up the freedom to give ourselves brain damage through drugs and violence. And we do all that, at least in part, because we recognize the potential consequences of not giving up those freedoms. But all too often we claim special privilege to such behaviors, and that destructive individualism is a major source of the common Christian ambivalence towards democracy and government. Having to account for the well-being of others can threaten the Christian concern with individualism and freedom. It's remarkable how the people sporting the "Don't Tread on Me" flag always seem to be the ones so quick to tread on others. And despite all this, Christians still somehow claim objective morality with a straight face. They contend that without God there would be nothing to restrain us from an endless cycle of deceit, theft, rape, and murder. And don't get me wrong, there was a time when I advanced that same infantile logic, but I was in grade school, and with experience and education, the glaring inconsistencies of that perspective became overwhelming. If that is indeed the natural human condition, how is it that we survived the first 200,000 years of our existence, prior to being enlightened with Christian morals? In reality, there doesn't need to be any supernatural reward for moral behavior. There doesn't need to be any God watching us to motivate that behavior, and we can do far better than the Ten Commandments. Oddly enough, Christians have all of those, yet demonstrate no tendency toward greater ethical behavior. Evolution-based objective morality means making every reasonable effort to avoid mentally or physically harming others, and ceaseless education to more fully comprehend the extent of influence that our behaviors can have. We don't need forgiveness for our moral transgressions. We need to learn from them. As always, so much thanks for watching. Catch you soon.